Hi there everyone, it's Russell. Welcome to the reading Fabricator, and today I'm capping off Cormac McCarthy with Stella Maris. Man, I was looking forward to this. I was a huge fan of the previous one he just released a couple months ago, The Passenger. Completely floored by it. I love the emotion that was in it, particularly involving the two characters, Bobby and Alicia Weston. Obviously, The Passenger, for those who have read it, know that it's about Bobby Weston and his struggles, particularly his relation to his sister and the harshness that he felt towards his father for his work on the atomic bomb and the Trinity Project. But Stella Maris is an entire beast altogether. It is preferably referred to as a coda. It is the final part of The Passenger, part two, so to speak. And when I first read The Passenger, I thought, well, why did they split it into two books? But now that I've read Stella Maris, I can understand why. I mean, there's no way you could fit this into that one. You could if you wanted to, but I just don't think it would have worked structurally. This is its own beast altogether. This is my first 5-star read of the year, and I can't believe it's almost at the end of the year and it's taken that long to get to a 5-star read, but it does. This is a perfect book in my opinion. I think it's absolutely brilliant. I think it contains one of the most fully realized characters in all of Cormac McCarthy's bibliography. When it comes to characters by Cormac McCarthy, they're generally vessels for his ideas and themes. And yes, some people would say that a lot of what Alicia says in this book here can be a representation of what Cormac is going for with all the research and studying and conversing he's done with many scientists and just in general by himself over the many years, especially during his time at the Santa Fe Institute. But I see it as more than that. When you strip away all the intellectualism, you find a truly, truly saddening character in Alicia Weston in this book, and in particular in Bobby Weston in The Passenger as well. And I can't think of any other characters in his previous books that hit me as hard as these two do in these latest two releases by him. It's truly a wonderful piece of work. I'm amazed by it. And if this is the final book to be released by him in his lifetime, well, then it is a perfect way to end. It is a culmination of all the ideas and everything that he's conjured in the decades of writing up to this point. This has been referred to as Cormac McCarthy 3.0 in terms of mathematics and ideas, the beginning of language, just everything. This book is packed to the brim with it at 200 pages. It is a quick read, but man, does it pack the intellectual wallop of a lifetime. There is just so much involved in this book. So much that I had to stop and sort of just do a bit of research myself just to find out what he's talking about. There's a lot of mini monologues that could be sort of brief essays, so to speak, but it was enthralling. I absolutely fell hard for what was going on in this book. Truly, truly did. Resident Unit, case 72118, October 27, 1972. Patient is a 20-year-old Jewish Caucasian female, attractive, possibly anorexic. Arrived at this facility 6 days ago, apparently by bus and without luggage. Admission signed by Dr. Wegner. Patient had a plastic bag full of $100 bills in her purse, something over $40,000, which she attempted to give to the receptionist. Patient is a doctoral candidate in mathematics at the University of Chicago and has been diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic with a long-standing etiology of visual and auditory hallucinations. Resident of this facility on 2 prior occasions. So starts the book Stella Maris being a psychiatric facility in Wisconsin. Transcripts between herself and a doctor. And what starts as a formality between the two quickly becomes just a discussion on ideas and topics that eventually lead to cracks. You start seeing cracks where she slips through and will start discussing her personal life. And from there, you see the pain that she is experiencing, and it progresses through the book all the way to the very end. I mean, this is actually a very sad book when you think about it. When you strip away all of the intellectualism, you find something truly staggeringly heartbreaking about this book, which I also found in The Passenger as well. There were moments in The Passenger where the emotion just hit me pretty hard, unlike any other Cormac McCarthy book, and that includes The Road. I know a lot of people think The Road is an emotional book, but that was okay. This is a whole other level. This is something else in its entirety. It's all told in conversational pieces and dialogues, and I loved being able to get inside the mind of Alicia Weston. She's probably the most fascinating character, up there with the judge for me from Blood Meridian, and some of the monologues that she has discussing various topics, whether to do with philosophy or mathematics or the beginning of language or the universe in general, I think are up there with some of the writing in Blood Meridian, if not maybe even surpassing it. And it really, really just opened my eyes. I mean, this thin book, the second shortest book he's written other than Child of God. The fact that he was able to cram all this in there, some people have complained that it gave them a headache. They just don't think they were ready for it. But for me, what it meant was I was able to finish this. Then I want to go and do some research. Then I want to go and reread The Passenger and then reread Stella Maris. To me, it has reread value. There is just so much juice there to suckle through, just so much to get into. I just wanted to keep on going. I wanted the book to be longer, but I understand why it's so short. It is absolutely perfect in every way, shape, or form. Now, Stella Maris starts with Alicia going to the psychiatric hospital after she's come back from Europe, where she was with Bobby Weston when he was in his coma following the car crash, which was mentioned briefly in The Passenger, so that's no spoiler there. She was asked by the doctors if they could take him off life support, but she just ran away from it. Obviously, those who have read The Passenger know that Bobby survived the coma and has come back to America since, but she wasn't aware of it at the time. As far as she knows, in this book, he's still in the coma. And she just had nowhere else to go, so she just showed up at the hospital with the $40,000, which is left over from when Bobby was going around the country selling all these gold coins and amassing hundreds of thousands of dollars, of which he gave half to her, and of which she spent a fortune of it on a musical instrument, a very rare musical instrument from the, can't remember if it was from the 1800s or 1700s, but it's probably her most precious item. And through these conversations, you see little connections that come back into play and that give The Passenger more of a standing in high relevance. I mean, there are parts in this where I'm wanting to go back to The Passenger and read sections that connect to that as well and just see the little differences. And it was truly an enriching, rewarding piece of fiction. There is a lot of name dropping in this, I'm not going to lie, and there's quite a few names like Wittgenstein and Gödel and some of the mathematicians that she hung out with and was writing her dissertation around. And there are quite a few names that I just did not know, so there was a lot of research that had to be done on my part, and I must admit there's plenty in this book which I went over my head, so I just had to go along with it. But I'm going to do a lot more research before I go back and reread this book. But it's not just that as well. I mean, there's plenty that deal with her life as well, including living with her grandmother, her mother, talking about her father who died of cancer in Mexico. There's an absolutely brutal scene where she talks about how her brother Bobby went into Mexico to try and find where the father was buried. He spends weeks down there, and when he comes back up and she meets with him, she sees him, he's an absolute total ghost. He's lost so much weight, he's pale. She really thought that he was going to do himself in, and it's one of the saddening moments where she reaches over to try and touch him, and he's crying his eyes out. I think it's in a restaurant. It's moments like those that are littered throughout, that are peppered throughout, but not in a heavy-handed way, that you realize that there's something truly saddening going on in this book. So the intellectualism and the smart writing style sort of cover it up a little bit, but when you dig deep, you see what a truly heartbreaking book this Stella Maris really is. Another chapter, I think it's chapter 5 or chapter 6, where she finally starts talking about Bobby. For most of the book, she's been alluding to him, but refuses to answer the doctor's questions. She's being a bit of a smile aleck at times, but she finally breaks down and talks about Bobby Weston and talks about how the only times that she ever actually dressed up and worried about her hygiene was when she was going dancing with him. He'd get up there and play an instrument of the band, and she'd go dancing, and she professed her absolute love for him, including having dreams about him. And dreams seems to be a recurring motif in Cormac's work. I noticed it in The Passenger and especially in this. And going back through his other books, including No Country for Old Men, in particular the ending of that, I've noticed that dreams seem to play a big part in Cormac's writing. I'm not sure why that is, and it's only been up till now where I've actually just noticed it. So that's something I want to go back to when I reread his work at a future date. I want to see how much dreams play a role in his writing. It's one of the few things that went over my head when I've been reading his books, but I really want to give it another go at that. As for the whole thing, I'd say it was around page 40 where I actually started to fall for the book pretty hard. In particular, one paragraph where she talks about the universe in such a beautiful way. So I'm going to read that section to you now. In the beginning was the Word, but don't believe that? One of the things I realized was that the universe had been evolving for countless billions of years in total darkness and total silence, and that the way that we imagine it is not the way that it was. In the beginning always was nothing. The novae exploding silently in total darkness, the stars, the passing comets, everything at best of alleged being, black fires like the fires of hell, silence, nothingness, night, black suns herding the planets through a universe where the concept of space was meaningless for want of any end to it, for want of any concept to stand it against, and the question once again of the nature of that reality to which there was no witness. All of this until the first living creature possessed of vision agreed to imprint the universe upon its primitive and trembling sensorium, and then to touch it with color and movement and memory. It made of me an overnight solipsist, and to some extent I am yet. That's just marvelous. There are so many passages in this book that are up there in the top 1% of the greatest writers living today. I mean, to my mind, Cormac McCarthy is the greatest living writer. This book cements it. I cannot stress that enough. There is an absolutely wonderful use of language and wording in this book, and the way he conjures it and is able to compact it all together into a readable format just makes him a superstar in my mind. It's truly, truly wonderful. There's another passage around 110. This is where she took me out of personal life when she went to high school when she was 12 years old. And it's one of her earliest sexual encounters or sensual feelings towards another person. She was 12 years old, went to high school, and it involves a 16-year-old boy. So this is the psychiatrist saying, I take it that there was such an experience. There was. Is this something that you would be willing to share? It will sound trivial, all right? It was in the hallway at school between classes. In high school? Yes. This boy who was a senior stopped me and asked me to turn around. He was captain of the basketball team, and he was generally thought to be about the coolest guy in the school. And he had a paper and a ballpoint in his hand, and he made this twirling motion with his finger, and he said, let me borrow your back. And this girl was standing there with him watching, and I turned around, and he put the paper on my back and wrote on it. I don't know what it was. Maybe he just signed it. I don't know. And maybe he knew what he was doing. I mean, he could have just used the wall or a locker door, but I turned around and he wrote on my back, and I closed my eyes. It was enormously sensual. I thought at first that it was just that shivery feeling like someone's fingers going up your back, but it was more than that. I felt that he was writing something to me. I could feel the girl watching me. She was suddenly curious. She was probably 16. When he'd finished, he said thanks, and I opened my eyes, and they were gone down the hall. All these different pieces of dialogue just give you a real vast scope of how complex an individual Alicia Western was. I mean, she's a child prodigy, an absolute mathematician prodigy. She would spend 18 to 20 hours a day just reading countless books. There's a mention of her one day just driving around the country, going to various hotels and just reading, finding books that have been out of print for years, coming up with fake ID cards at various universities just to rent out books, loan out books that no one else had read. She has a vast array of knowledge in her head, and I've never encountered a character like her ever in a Cormac McCarthy book. She's a fascinating individual, and the fact that this is the first main female character that he has written in, I think, 54 years, since 1968's Outer Dark, which I liked a little bit. I thought Outer Dark was okay. It's not one of my favorites of his, but to see him conjure up this absolute being of true intelligence is something else entirely. And yes, I can see how some people again would say that she is just a vessel for his ideas, but he has peppered enough information in this book to be able to make her come across as a human being. I mean, she is a true human being. This is someone that you grow to care for. She herself grapples with the idea of her father being involved with the Trinity test, the atomic bombs, and all that testing that was going on in New Mexico when she was there as a kid. And a great passage details what her father at the actual Trinity test itself when they tested the first bomb. Absolutely wonderful moment. I'm going to read it to you now. This is a psychiatrist talking first. Where is Trinity? Is that in Nevada? New Mexico. Was your father there? Yes, of course. Did he talk about that? Not much. I've read the standard accounts. My father's group was about 6 miles from ground zero. They'd been given glasses that were very dark. I think something like welding goggles. But my father had brought his own because he didn't think you'd be able to see much with the government-issued glasses. I guess you can read that as a metaphor, but all the glasses had to do was block the ultraviolet light. They listened to the countdown over a loudspeaker. They were a pretty nervous lot. Some that it would go off and some that it wouldn't. The thing I remember my father saying was that he put his hands over his goggles against the initial flare of light, and that when it came, he could see the bones of his fingers with his eyes closed. There was no sound, just a searing white light, and then the reddish-purple cloud rising in billows and flowering into the iconic white mushroom, symbol of an age. The whole thing standing slowly to 10,000 feet. The wind from the shockwave was supersonic, and it hurt your ears for just a moment. And lastly, of course, the sound of it, the ungodly detonation followed by the slow rumble, the afterclap that rolled away over the burning countryside into a world that had never existed before this side of the sun. The desert creatures evaporating without a cry, and the scientists watching with this thing standing twinned in the black lenses of their goggles, and my father watching it through his fingers like see no evil. But if they knew nothing else, they all knew it was too late for that. Now, all the parts that I've been reading to you are to do with her talking about her father, the Trinity Project, and her first sensual experience in high school. So there are backstories to her. You do find out a lot about her, but yes, in essence, this is a mathematical novel with plenty of theorems, lots to do with language and philosophy. And the last piece I'm going to read to you is her views on the arrival of language. And it dates back to 5 years ago when Cormac McCarthy produced this essay. I think it was called The Kakule Problem. So when I read this, it immediately reminded me of that. A really interesting essay that he published in between this book or The Passenger and The Road. But it's good to see him harken back to that. So he must have fit some of that in this book while he was writing about it. This is page 174, which is close to the end. It's not a spoiler in any way. I just think it's an absolutely marvelous bit of philosophy. The arrival of language was like the invasion of a parasitic system, co-opting those areas of the brain that were the least dedicated, the most susceptible to appropriation. A parasitic invasion. Yes, you're serious. Yes, the inner guidance of a living system is as necessary to its survival as oxygen and hydrogen. The governance of any system evolves coevally with the system itself. Everything from a blink to a cough to a decision to run for your life. Every faculty but language has the same history. The only rules of evolution that language follows are those necessary to its own construction. A process that took little more than an eye blink. The extraordinary usefulness of language turned it into an overnight epidemic. It seems to have spread to every remote pocket of humanity almost instantly. The same isolation of groups that led to their uniqueness would seem to have been no protection at all against this invasion, and both the form of language and the strategies by which it gained purchase in the brain seem all but universal. The most immediate requirement was for an increased capacity for making sounds. Language seems to have originated in South Africa, and this requirement probably accounts for the cliques in the Caucasian languages. The fact that there were more things to name than sounds to name them with. In any case, the physical facility for speech was probably the most difficult hurdle. The pharynx became elongated until the apparatus in its present form has all but strangled its owner. We're the only mammalian species that can't swallow and articulate at the same time. Think of a cat growling while it eats and then try it yourself. Anyway, the unconscious system of guidance is millions of years old, speech less than 100,000. The brain had no idea any of this was coming. The unconscious must have had to do all sorts of scrambling around to accommodate a system that proved perfectly relentless. Not only is it comparable to a parasitic invasion, it's not comparable to anything else. So that's one of many little tiny dissertations that she gives the doctor throughout the book, and this is the same doctor that gives these many discussions. He's recording these conversations when he's talking to her, and as I said before, she has been at the facility twice before, and the previous doctors that she's spoken to seem to just don't understand her, but this one does. This one manages to break through with her, and by doing that, he's able to see into her past and just get a grip on what she's like as a human being. In particular, talks with her with regards to the thalidomide kid who's mentioned quite a lot throughout this book, but mostly to do with her relationship to her parents, her grandmother, and in particular to her brother Bobby Weston, who she was infatuated with, who she asked him to marry her. Obviously, he did not reciprocate those feelings to her, except for during a couple of kissing scenes in a car. But she's a very complex individual. She's probably the most complex individual in all of Cormac McCarthy's bibliography, up there with the judge at least, and maybe even Anton Chigurh, even though she's not a villain in any way, shape or form. This is a 5-star read. It is, in my mind, a perfect book. And if it truly is the end for McCarthy, if it truly is the final book released by him, not only is this the perfect coda to The Passenger, a perfect fitting end to that book, but it's a perfect coda in general to his bibliography. It is everything that he has been striving towards and writing about and researching and studying and conversing with other scientists about for decades leading up to this moment. He crammed everything he learned into a 200-page book, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It is a perfect finish to a brilliant writing career, and it will be a sad day when Cormac McCarthy passes, which, given his age, unfortunately will be too soon. He was hoping he wins the Nobel Prize while he's still alive, right? Yeah, I just get really emotional when I talk about him. I think he's a brilliant writer. Yeah. Anyway, that is Stella Maris, and if I'm going to put a disclaimer out there, if you're one that has a bit of mental health issues, then approach this book with caution because it does deal with suicide quite a bit, including one distressing whole section which is quite elongated, where she talks about how she drove up to a lake. She's at the bank of the lake, and she's thinking about taking a boat out there to the deepest point, where the deepest point in this lake is about 1,600 feet, tying an anchor around her and dropping to the depths to her death. But she describes to the doctor how all these problems that will occur, including the fact that she'll run out of air before the anchor hits the bottom, and what will happen to her physical body while she is dying, while she's going to the bottom of the lake. It's told in a really distressingly scientific way. So there's plenty of talks of suicide in this book, but they are described in a very scientific way, so it keeps you at arm's reach. But there is still emotion to be found there. She doesn't go through it, obviously, because she's talking about in this book, but those that have read The Passenger obviously know what happens to her in the end. So if you are a stickler for that sort of thing, or find it hard to read, then maybe Stella Maris is not your thing. But if you push through, you'll see a truly heartbreaking book, an intellectual book full of many smart pieces of writing. But if you break through that, if you push through that, you will piece it together and see that there is some saddening moments to be found in this. But it's one of the saddest books I've ever read, honestly. But it's also a brilliant book, and I wouldn't have it any other way, honestly. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been to your liking. And if this is your first time to my channel, then by all means, feel free to subscribe, because I've got a few books that I think you might like that are somewhat comparable to this. Also, I'm going to be reading American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of Robert Oppenheimer, which will make a great segue from the Cormac McCarthy books, given how their father worked with Oppenheimer. It's a thick beast, but I want to get through that by the end of the year, so that'll be a good one. And I'm going to finally get back to Thomas Pynchon with Mason and Dixon. It's one of the few books of his left to read. I haven't read a Thomas Pynchon book in 3.5 years since Gravity's Rainbow. And of the big three that he's released, Gravity's Rainbow, Mason and Dixon, and A Gangster Day, the only one I have read is Gravity's Rainbow. I'm going to leave A Gangster Day till last because it's a big fucking book. But yeah, if that's your sort of thing, but by all means, subscribe and let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and yeah, catch you on the next one. Bye.